Question I want to ask you. I know, well, this is a personal assessment, and I want to see where you come with what you bring to this. I noticed that in the 60s, your music sounded, in the late 60s and in the mid 70s, your music took on a little different weight and clarity. Was it just from maturity, or was there a revelation inside your own experience? The music just seemed to have a little bit more, not depth to say that it was lacking beforehand, but something about the presentation and the interpretation of music just, for me, had a weight.
Well,
did you realize that as well?
Yeah, well, in the 60s, I was writing a lot of my own music, my own arrangements. I used a small band, which consisted of 2 trumpets, tenor, alto, baritone, rhythm section. That's the way I recorded most of my material during the 60s. Now, in the 70s, I changed record companies. I went to a CTI label, where they use different arrangers, people like Bob James, Don Sebesky, and Marty Page. And there were an addition of strings, and the music sounded a little more pop-orientated during the 70s, you know. But it wasn't my style of playing. It was the way the arrangers were writing the music. So, yeah, the 60s was different, the 70s was different. Then back in the 80s, I went back to writing myself. So, yeah, that was a slight change, but not too much, you know. It was basically the same. We just had larger bands and string sections, you know. The music was presented at that time like they would, you never heard of instrumentalists being recorded with big bands and strings, you know. But during the 70s, Creed Taylor did that for us because we were over at CTI, and there were people like Stanley Turrentine, Grover Washington, Freddie Hubbard, and they threw all these big orchestrations at us, you know. So that's what really changed, but we didn't really change our styles, you know. We just presented bigger orchestrations.
Okay, so it was just the masses, okay. Who's out there now, as far as a saxophone player, I guess I'll stick with that, that's interested in keeping the flame alive as far as what the tradition, you're pretty much a traditional musician, wouldn't you say?
Sure.
So who's keeping the tradition alive nowadays?
You know,
or is that necessary? Or do you think it's always just...
Oh, it's necessary. You know, I don't really know a lot of these guys personally, the young players, but I can tell you this. There are a lot of good young players out on the scene now. The ones that's known more, I guess, would be Wynton Marsalis in Branford. And...
are they keeping the flame alive?
I would say...
Or are they just known?
No, I would say they're sort of keeping the flame alive because maybe they might be the only 2 that's been allowed to sort of get their foot in the door of the industry, you know. And in that way, it's good. But they're still young. They've got a lot of planning to do. But I just can't name these guys by name. I'm just really getting the opportunity of meeting a lot of them. But believe me, there are a lot of great young players because they want to know what the music is about. Because during the 70s, the music became 2-chord vamps, you know, just vamp. It's the same changes, you know. There were no songs being played, you know, no 32 bars or anything. It was just 2-bar changes. And it was not good for learning how to play the instrument. So I think, like I say, every 10 years, it changes. They said disco would never go away. And it lasted and it's gone, you know. It's another name for it now, you know. And
so they just turn out to be fads, you're basically saying.
Yeah, just turn out to be that, you know. So it's changing, but they'll be heard. They are there. A lot of good musicians. They just don't have the venues. When I was coming up, we had a lot of jam sessions, you know. You go from club to club. You had a lot of venues to work and play and study, you know. But there aren't many now, you know. But the players are there, and as long as there are players there, will be places that will have to open so they can play. So sure, there's a lot of good musicians out there. Young
so it's
players.
Basically a misrepresentation when people say that jazz, there's probably a possibility that it won't survive the next 100
That's
years.
wrong. That's wrong.
It's entirely wrong.
That's wrong. Like I say, man, it's the foundation of all music. It's the root. It'll never leave. It'll never leave. I don't care how they try to make this fad out of this, you know, every 10 years or so, but you got to go back to the basics. Still C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Either way you look at it, that's all the notes there are. You know.
Speaking of roots, since you used that word just a second ago, there was a point in time when there was artists such as Benny Goodman and his likes, white artists, basically, not just basically, but white artists, were the ones who were reaping the benefit of what we call jazz. And people said that artists such as Hank Crawford kind of brought it back, kind of brought jazz back into the community where it became an African experience again.
Well,
we defined it ourselves again, as we once did.
Well, I think we'd have to go back and refer to people like Lionel Hampton, who was one of the first blacks to get involved into that so-called swing era, big band era, when there were the Dorsey brothers and the Goodmans and the Stan Kens, you know. And again, I grew up in that era, so I was exposed to a lot of big band music too. So when I started writing and composing, a lot of the music that I played was built on those kind of foundations. You know, I mean, we had the Louis Armstrongs, we had the Barry Bixes, you know, but for the same reason that exists now, you know, they couldn't get in the door to present it, but they were always there. We just didn't have the opportunity to expose it, as you would say the early white bands did. But out of those bands came great players, like I said, Lionel Hampton and Louis Armstrong, you know, people